concert hall in Vienna buzzed with anticipation as nearly 2,000 people settled into their velvet seats. It was May 2019, and the Vienna Musikverein, one of the most prestigious concert venues in the world, was hosting its annual international piano competition finals. The golden interior gleamed under the chandeliers, and the atmosphere crackled with the kind of energy that only comes when the world's elite musicians gather in one place. Among the audience members were critics from major publications, representatives from record labels, and classical music enthusiasts who had flown in from across Europe just to witness this event. Backstage, 17-year-old Sophie Bergmann sat quietly in the green room, her fingers resting gently on her lap. She wore a simple black dress that her mother had helped her choose, and her long dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Her eyes, clouded by the congenital condition that had left her blind since birth, stared ahead at nothing in particular. But her other senses were heightened, taking in everything around her. She could hear the muffled sounds of the audience through the walls, smell the wood polish and old books that seemed to permeate every corner of the historic building, and feel the nervous energy radiating from the other competitors who paced and practiced scales in the hallway outside. Sophie had made it to the finals against all odds. She was the youngest competitor and the only one with a visual impairment. The preliminary rounds had been challenging, not just musically but emotionally. She'd felt the whispers, the skeptical glances that she couldn't see but could sense in the way conversations stopped when she entered a room. Some people genuinely questioned whether a blind pianist could compete at this level. Others simply found her presence unusual, a curiosity rather than a serious contender. But Sophie had learned long ago to let her music speak for itself. In the hallway outside, Dmitry Volkov held court with a group of admirers and journalists. At 42, he was at the peak of his career, a Russian pianist whose technical brilliance and commanding stage presence had earned him international fame. He had won this same competition 20 years earlier, launching a career that included performances with every major orchestra in the world, dozens of acclaimed recordings, and a reputation for perfection that bordered on arrogance. Dmitry had been invited back as a special guest performer and judge, and he clearly relished the attention. A journalist from a German music magazine asked Dmitry about the finalists, and his eyes gleamed as he launched into his assessment. He spoke about the technical prowess of a 23-year-old from South Korea, the interpretive maturity of a Japanese contestant, and the raw power of an American pianist. Then someone mentioned Sophie Bergmann, and Dmitry's expression shifted to something between amusement and disdain. He said he found it admirable that the competition organizers wanted to be inclusive, but this was a serious musical event, not a charity showcase. The journalist pressed him, noting that Sophie had scored highly in the preliminary rounds. Dmitry waved his hand dismissively. He said that anyone could memorize pieces and play them adequately, but real artistry required a connection to the visual aspects of performance, the ability to read the room, to see the conductor, to respond to the physical presence of an orchestra. He suggested that judging a blind pianist by the same standards as sighted ones was actually doing her a disservice, setting her up for inevitable disappointment. His words were delivered with a smile, in a tone that suggested he was simply being realistic rather than cruel. But his words carried down the hallway, through the partially open door of the green room where Sophie sat. She heard every syllable, felt each one land like a physical blow. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, now clenched into fists. Her mother, Anna, who sat beside her, heard it too. Anna reached for her daughter's hand, but Sophie pulled away gently. She didn't want comfort right now. She wanted to prove him wrong. Sophie had been playing piano since she was 4 years old. Her parents, both music teachers in a small Austrian town, had noticed her gravitating toward their piano, touching the keys with a reverence that seemed beyond her years. When they realized their daughter was drawn to music in a way that transcended her visual limitations, they nurtured that gift carefully. Her father built a special system of textured markers she could feel on the keys when she was learning new pieces. Her mother spent countless hours describing the emotional landscapes of compositions, helping Sophie understand not just the notes but the stories they told. As Sophie grew older, her talent became undeniable. She didn't just play music, she inhabited it. Her fingers found nuances that other pianists missed, subtle shadings of tone and tempo that revealed depths in familiar pieces. She developed a technique that was entirely her own, relying on touch and sound and an almost supernatural sense of spatial awareness. By the time she was 15, she was performing in regional competitions and winning consistently. But the path to international recognition was steep, and she faced obstacles that had nothing to do with her musical ability. There had been competitions that refused to accommodate her needs, organizers who politely suggested she might be more comfortable in events specifically for disabled musicians. There had been teachers who doubted whether she could ever perform at the highest levels, well-meaning people who encouraged her to set more realistic goals. And there had been moments, dark private moments, when Sophie herself had wondered if they were right. Maybe she was fooling herself. Maybe there were limits to what she could achieve, barriers that had nothing to do with talent and everything to do with the world's inability to imagine a blind person succeeding in a visual art form. But then she would sit at the piano and all those doubts would dissolve. The piano didn't care if she could see. The music didn't judge her by anything except how well she played it. When her fingers touched those keys, she was as capable as anyone, more capable than most. The piano was the one place in the world where her blindness truly didn't matter, where she could compete on equal footing with anyone. Or at least, that's what she had believed until she heard Dmitry Volkov's casual dismissal of everything she'd worked for. Anna watched her daughter's face and saw the transformation happening. The hurt was still there, but it was hardening into something else, something fiercer. Sophie stood up and asked her mother to help her find a practice room. There were still 2 hours before the finals began, and she wanted to run through her pieces one more time. Anna knew better than to argue. She recognized the determination in her daughter's voice, the same steel that had carried Sophie through years of skepticism and low expectations. They found an empty practice room, and Sophie sat at the upright piano, letting her fingers find their places on the keys. She didn't play her competition pieces right away. Instead, she played a simple scale, slowly, feeling each note resonate through her body. Then she played it again, faster, more confident. She let the muscle memory take over, let her hands remember what they knew, what they'd always known. The piano became an extension of herself, and for those precious minutes, nothing else existed except the sound. In the main hall, the audience was taking their seats for the finals. The 5 judges, including Dmitry Volkov, settled into their positions in the front row, score sheets and pencils ready. Dmitry looked relaxed, almost bored. He had judged dozens of competitions, heard thousands of pianists. Very few surprised him anymore. He expected this evening would follow a predictable pattern. Some good playing, some mediocre playing, and ultimately a winner who would probably have a modest career before fading into obscurity. That was how these things usually went. The competition director took the stage and welcomed everyone, explaining the format. Each finalist would perform 2 pieces, one from the Romantic period and one of their own choosing. The performances would be evaluated on technical precision, interpretive depth, and overall artistry. The judge's decision would be final. The audience applauded politely, and the first contestant, a young man from South Korea, took the stage. He played brilliantly, his fingers racing through a list etude with impressive speed and accuracy. Dmitry nodded approvingly, making notes on his sheet. The second and third contestants also performed well, each bringing their own strengths to the stage. The audience was appreciative but not overwhelmed. These were good pianists, clearly talented but nothing exceptional. Dmitry found his mind wandering during the third performance, thinking about the dinner reservation he'd made at his favorite Viennese restaurant. Then the competition director announced the 4th finalist, Sophie Bergman, and Dmitry sat up a bit straighter, curious to see how this would play out. Sophie walked onto the stage guided by her mother, who led her to the piano bench and then quietly exited. The audience grew very still, watching this slender blind girl settle herself at the massive concert grand. Sophie took a moment to orient herself, her hands gently exploring the keyboard, finding middle C, establishing her bearings. Some in the audience shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to feel about what they were witnessing. Was this inspiring or inappropriate? Should they admire her courage or pity her presumption? Dmitry leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral but his thoughts dismissive. He had already made up his mind about this performance before a single note was played. He would be polite in his evaluation, perhaps even generous, but ultimately he would score her lower than the others. It wasn't personal, it was simply realistic. And then Sophie placed her hands on the keys, took one deep breath, and began to play. The first note emerged from the piano like a whisper, so soft that the audience instinctively leaned forward to hear it. Sophie had chosen to open with Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor, a piece known for its delicate melancholy and technical demands. But from that very first note, it was clear that something extraordinary was happening. The sound she drew from the piano was unlike anything the audience had heard that evening. It wasn't just technically precise, it was alive, breathing, full of an emotion that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within her soul. Dmitry's pen, poised above his scoresheet, froze in midair. His expression of polite condescension began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, into something closer to attention. Sophie's fingers moved across the keys with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for someone who couldn't see them. There was no hesitation, no fumbling, just pure musical expression flowing through her hands. The Chopin Nocturne was notoriously difficult to interpret, a piece that could easily become saccharine or overly sentimental in the wrong hands. But Sophie played it with a restraint and depth that revealed new layers in the familiar composition. In the audience, people stopped shifting in their seats. The usual concert hall sounds, the quiet coughs and rustling programs faded away entirely. Everyone was listening now, truly listening, in a way they hadn't been for the previous performances. There was something hypnotic about watching Sophie play. Her face was serene, almost distant, as if she had gone somewhere else entirely. Her body swayed gently with the music, not in a performative way but as a natural response to the sounds she was creating. She seemed to be having a conversation with the piano, listening to it as much as playing it. The technical aspects of her performance were flawless. Her fingers navigated the complex passages with precision, her pedaling was perfectly timed, and her dynamic control was extraordinary. But what truly set her apart was the emotional intelligence in every phrase. She understood the architecture of the piece, knew exactly when to push forward and when to pull back, when to let a note ring out and when to let silence speak. She played with a maturity that seemed impossible for someone her age, blind or not. Dmitri found himself leaning forward despite his earlier skepticism. He had heard this nocturne performed hundreds of times by some of the world's best pianists. He had played it himself countless times throughout his career. But Sophie was finding things in it that he had never noticed before, subtle harmonic colors and emotional nuances that most pianists glossed over. His critical mind tried to find fault, to identify technical errors or interpretive missteps, but there was nothing. She was simply playing at a level that transcended normal evaluation. The other judges were experiencing similar revelations. Maria Keller, a renowned Austrian pianist in her 60s, felt tears forming in her eyes. She had been skeptical when Sophie's application had come across her desk months earlier. A blind teenager competing at this level seemed like a publicity stunt, a feel-good story that would ultimately prove embarrassing for everyone involved. Maria had almost voted against including Sophie in the competition. Now, listening to this extraordinary performance, she felt ashamed of her own prejudice and grateful that she had been outvoted. As Sophie transitioned into the second half of the nocturne, the piece's darker, more turbulent section, her playing took on a new intensity. Her hands moved with increasing passion across the keys, drawing out the conflict and yearning embedded in Chopin's composition. She wasn't just playing notes, she was telling a story, painting emotions in sound. The audience was completely transfixed. Some people had closed their eyes, the better to focus on the pure sound. Others watched Sophie's hands with fascination, trying to understand how someone who couldn't see could navigate the keyboard with such absolute confidence. In the green room, the remaining finalist, a talented 25-year-old from France, listened to Sophie's performance through the monitor and felt his heart sink. He had been feeling confident about his chances, had rehearsed his pieces to perfection. But listening to Sophie, he knew he was witnessing something rare and special. This wasn't just good playing, this was artistry of the highest order. Whatever happened in this competition, he knew he would remember this performance for the rest of his life. Sophie brought the Chopin Nocturne to its quiet, ethereal conclusion, the final notes hanging in the air like a question that didn't need an answer. For a moment after she finished, there was absolute silence in the hall. It was the kind of silence that follows truly great performances, when the audience needs a moment to return to reality, to process what they've just experienced. Then the applause began, tentative at first, then building into something powerful and sustained. People rose to their feet, not out of politeness or sympathy, but because they had just witnessed something genuinely extraordinary. Sophie sat at the piano, her hands still resting lightly on the keys, her face calm. She could hear the applause, feel the vibrations of hundreds of people standing and clapping, but she remained composed. This wasn't over yet. She still had her second piece to perform. She waited for the applause to die down, took another deep breath, and prepared herself for the next challenge. She had chosen Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire, a composition that required not just skill but extraordinary physical stamina and emotional range. As Sophie launched into the Rachmaninoff, the audience realized that the Chopin had not been a fluke. If anything, her playing became even more commanding, more powerful. The Rachmaninoff Prelude is a piece of almost orchestral complexity, with thick chords, rapid passages, and dramatic dynamic contrasts. Sophie attacked it with a confidence that was breathtaking. Her small frame seemed to grow larger at the piano as she drew massive sounds from the instrument, then moments later could produce passages of heartbreaking delicacy. Dmitri Volkov sat in his judge's chair, his scoresheet now covered with notes and observations, his earlier dismissiveness completely evaporated. He was watching a master class in piano performance, and the person giving it was a 17-year-old blind girl he had insulted just hours earlier. The realization of his own arrogance hit him with physical force. He had made assumptions based on nothing but prejudice, had dismissed Sophie's abilities without even hearing her play. He had called himself a realist, but he had simply been blind in a way that Sophie, despite her disability, had never been. The Rachmaninoff built to its thunderous conclusion, Sophie's hands crashing down on the keys with controlled power, drawing every possible ounce of sound from the piano. The final chord rang out and slowly faded, and once again the hall fell into that pregnant silence. Then the applause erupted even louder than before. People were not just standing, they were cheering, shouting bravos, some openly weeping. In 20 years of competitions, the Musikverein had rarely witnessed a response like this. Sophie stood and took her bow, her face still showing that same serene composure. Anna rushed onto the stage to guide her daughter off, and as they walked past the judge's table, Dmitri caught Anna's eye. There was something in the mother's gaze, not quite accusation but a knowing look that said she had heard his earlier comments and would not forget them. Dmitri looked away, feeling a shame that was unfamiliar and uncomfortable. The final contestant performed well, but it was almost cruel to follow Sophie. The French pianist did his best, played with skill and musicality, but the audience was still processing what they had just heard. When he finished, the applause was respectful but restrained. Everyone in the hall knew what the judge's decision would be. There was no real suspense anymore. The judges retired to deliberate, though the conversation was brief. All 5 judges gave Sophie the highest scores. Maria Keller spoke passionately about the prejudice they had all harbored, consciously or unconsciously, and how Sophie had demolished every assumption about what a blind musician could achieve. Another judge pointed out that Sophie's blindness might actually be an advantage in some ways, forcing her to develop an internal sense of the music that sighted pianists often neglected in favor of visual cues and showmanship. Dmitri remained mostly quiet during the deliberation, speaking only when directly asked for his opinion. He gave Sophie top marks and agreed she was the clear winner, but he seemed distracted, troubled. When the other judges began discussing the formal announcement, he asked if he could have a moment alone before they returned to the hall. The others agreed, sensing that something was weighing on their famous colleague. Alone in the deliberation room, Dmitri sat with his head in his hands. He was experiencing something he had not felt in years, genuine humility. His career had been built on his exceptional talent, but also on his confidence, his certainty that he knew what great music was and who was capable of creating it. Sophie had shattered that certainty. She had shown him that his understanding of music and ability was limited, that he had been operating with blinders he didn't even know he wore. He thought about the things he had said in the hallway, the casual cruelty of his dismissal. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his assessment. He had reduced Sophie to her disability, had seen only what she lacked rather than what she possessed. And in doing so, he had revealed his own limitations, his own blindness. The irony was not lost on him. The judges returned to the hall and the audience quieted in anticipation. The competition director took the microphone and began the formal announcement, building the suspense in the traditional way. But everyone already knew. When Sophie Bergmann's name was announced as the winner, the applause was immediate and overwhelming. People stood and cheered as Anna guided Sophie back onto the stage. The girl's composure finally cracked just a little, a smile breaking across her face, tears gathering in her sightless eyes. The competition director presented Sophie with the trophy and the prize envelope, then announced that she would perform one more piece as the newly crowned champion. This was tradition, but it also felt necessary. The audience wanted to hear her play again, needed to confirm that what they had experienced earlier was real and not some collective hallucination. Sophie nodded and returned to the piano, sitting down with a familiarity that came from thousands of hours of practice. She announced that she would play Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece beloved by audiences but often dismissed by serious musicians as overplayed and sentimental. But when Sophie began to play, any cynicism dissolved immediately. She brought a freshness to the familiar melody, finding new colors and emotions in music that most people thought they knew by heart. The piece became a meditation, a conversation between light and shadow, between certainty and doubt. It was the perfect ending to an extraordinary evening. As Sophie played, Dmitri made a decision. He stood quietly from his judge's seat and walked backstage away from the audience. He needed to speak with Sophie and her mother, needed to apologize for his comments. It wasn't about salvaging his reputation or appearing gracious in defeat of his own prejudices. It was about acknowledging a wrong and trying, however inadequately, to make it right. He waited in the hallway outside the green room, rehearsing what he would say, knowing that no words could fully capture his regret. When Sophie finished her encore performance, the audience gave her a final standing ovation. She left the stage with her mother, both of them overwhelmed by the response, by the magnitude of what had just happened. As they walked down the hallway toward the green room, they saw Dmitri waiting. Anna's body tensed, protective instincts immediately activated. But Dmitri raised his hands in a gesture of peace and asked if he could speak with them for just a moment. Sophie heard his voice and recognized it from the hallway earlier. She felt Anna tense beside her and understood why. But something in Dmitri's tone was different now, lacking the arrogant confidence she had heard before. She told her mother it was okay, and they stopped to listen to what he had to say. Dmitri looked at this remarkable young woman, this person he had dismissed so casually, and felt the full weight of his shame. He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully. He told Sophie that he had said terrible things earlier, things born from ignorance and arrogance. He had judged her without knowing anything about her, had made assumptions based solely on her disability. He had been completely wrong, and her performance tonight had taught him something important about his own limitations. He had spent his career believing he understood music at the deepest level, but Sophie had shown him depths he had never even imagined. He asked for her forgiveness not because he deserved it, but because she deserved to hear a genuine apology. She deserved to hear a genuine apology. Sophie listened without interrupting, her face giving away nothing. When Dmitri finished, there was a long pause. Anna watched her daughter, ready to support whatever response she chose. Finally, Sophie spoke. She said she had heard worse things than what Dmitri had said, that she had spent her life dealing with people who assumed she couldn't do things because of her blindness. She had learned not to let those assumptions define her or limit her. But she also said that his words had hurt, particularly coming from someone she admired, someone whose recordings she had listened to for years. Dmitri felt those words like a punch to the gut. She had admired him, had learned from his music, and he had repaid that by dismissing her as a charity case. The shame intensified. Sophie continued, saying that she accepted his apology but hoped he would do more than just apologize to her. She hoped he would examine why he had made those assumptions, would think about how many other talented people he might have dismissed or discouraged over the years because they didn't fit his narrow definition of what a musician should be. Her words were not angry or accusatory, just honest and direct. Dmitri nodded, acknowledging the truth in what she said. He promised he would reflect on his prejudices, would try to be better. Then Sophie did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She asked Dmitri if he would be willing to perform a duet with her someday, perhaps at a future concert. She said she had always dreamed of playing with him, and despite everything, she still respected his artistry. The gesture was incredibly generous, offering him not just forgiveness but a path forward. Dmitri was speechless for a moment, overwhelmed by her grace. He agreed immediately, saying it would be an honor he did not deserve but would gratefully accept. They shook hands, and in that moment something shifted. This was not just an apology accepted, it was the beginning of what would become an important relationship, one that would change both of their lives in unexpected ways. News of Sophie's victory spread quickly through the classical music world. By the next morning, videos of her performance were circulating online, shared by musicians and music lovers around the globe. Major news outlets picked up the story, framing it in various ways. Some focused on the inspirational angle, the blind girl who overcame adversity. Others emphasized the pure artistry of her playing, arguing that her disability was irrelevant to her achievement. Sophie herself preferred the latter framing, but understood why people gravitated toward the former. Within a week, Sophie received invitations to perform at concert halls across Europe. Record labels reached out, eager to sign this young sensation. Her life transformed overnight from that of a talented but relatively unknown student to an international phenomenon. Anna worried about her daughter being overwhelmed, about the pressure and expectations that would now follow her everywhere. But Sophie seemed to take it all in stride, remaining focused on the music rather than the fame. Dmitri kept his promise to reflect on his prejudices. He gave an interview to a major classical music magazine in which he spoke candidly about his encounter with Sophie, about the assumptions he had made and the lesson he had learned. He talked about how the classical music world needed to expand its understanding of what musicians could be, needed to make space for people who didn't fit traditional molds. The interview was widely read and sparked important conversations in conservatories and concert halls around the world. 3 months after the competition, Dmitri and Sophie performed together for the first time at a benefit concert in Berlin. They played Schubert's Fantasia in F minor for piano 4 hands, a challenging duet that requires perfect coordination and mutual trust. The audience packed the hall, curious to see how this unlikely partnership would work. Some came for the music, others for the human drama, the redemption story of the arrogant master humbled by the blind prodigy. But when Dmitri and Sophie sat down at the piano together, all that narrative fell away. They played as equals, two musicians who understood and respected each other's artistry. Dmitri had to adjust his playing style, had to truly listen to his partner in ways he had never done before. He couldn't rely on visual cues, couldn't use glances or nods to communicate. Everything had to happen through sound, through touch, through an almost telepathic connection that developed as they played. It was one of the most challenging and rewarding musical experiences of his career. The performance was triumphant, the chemistry between them undeniable. Critics praised not just their technical precision, but the emotional depth they brought out in each other. Dmitri played with a vulnerability that audiences had never heard from him before, while Sophie showed a playfulness and joy that balanced her usual intensity. After the final notes faded and the applause began, Dmitri turned to Sophie and thanked her. She had given him a gift, the chance to rediscover music as something fresh and new rather than something he had mastered and moved beyond. The success of their Berlin performance led to more collaborations. Over the next year, Dmitri and Sophie performed together several more times, developing a musical partnership that surprised and delighted audiences. But their relationship extended beyond the stage. Dmitri became something of a mentor to Sophie, though he often joked that she taught him more than he taught her. He introduced her to conductors and orchestra managers, helped her navigate the complex politics of the classical music world, and advocated for her to be judged purely on her musical merits rather than as a curiosity or inspiration. Sophie, meanwhile, continued to break down barriers and challenge assumptions. She performed as a soloist with major orchestras, gave recitals in prestigious venues, and recorded her first album to critical acclaim. She also became an advocate for accessibility in the arts, working with music schools and concert halls to ensure that other disabled musicians would have opportunities to develop and showcase their talents. She spoke openly about the challenges she faced, not to complain but to educate, to help others understand what needed to change. In interviews, Sophie was always gracious when asked about Dmitri's initial comments and their subsequent friendship. She never used the story to paint herself as a victim or him as a villain. Instead, she framed it as an example of how people could grow and change, how prejudice could be overcome through direct experience and genuine humility. She said that Dmitri's willingness to admit he was wrong and to learn from his mistake was almost as important as her musical achievement that night in Vienna. Dmitri, for his part, experienced a renaissance in his own career. His playing took on new dimensions, informed by what he had learned from Sophie about listening, about finding meaning beyond technique, about approaching music with humility rather than mastery. Critics noticed the change, commenting that his recent performances had a warmth and emotional honesty that had sometimes been missing in his earlier work. He credited Sophie openly, telling anyone who would listen that she had saved him from becoming a musical fossil, trapped in his own expertise. 2 years after the Vienna competition, Sophie was invited to perform at Carnegie Hall in New York, one of the most iconic concert venues in the world. It was a milestone that many pianists never achieved in their entire careers. She was 19 years old. The concert sold out within hours of tickets going on sale, and the audience included many of the most important figures in classical music. Anna sat in the front row, her heart full of pride and gratitude for the journey they had taken together. Sophie's Carnegie Hall debut was everything it should have been. She played with the confidence of someone who had proven herself repeatedly, but also with the freshness and joy of someone still discovering what music could be. Her program included pieces by Bach, Beethoven, Chopin, and Rachmaninoff, as well as a contemporary work by a young blind composer she wanted to champion. Each piece was performed with the distinctive combination of technical mastery and emotional depth that had become her signature. But the most memorable moment came at the end of the concert. Sophie announced that she would close with a special duet, and Dmitri Volkov walked onto the stage to join her. The audience gasped and then burst into applause. This pairing had not been advertised, was not on the program. It was a surprise, a gift to the audience and to each other. They sat down together at the piano and performed Brahms' Hungarian Dance No. 5, a piece full of energy and joy and playfulness. As they played, trading melodies and supporting each other's musical ideas, it was impossible not to think about where they had started and where they had arrived. The arrogant master and the overlooked prodigy had become genuine partners, friends even. Their hands moved across the keyboard in perfect synchronization, creating something beautiful together. The music they made was not just technically excellent, it was meaningful, a testament to the possibility of growth and redemption and mutual respect. When they finished, the audience leaped to their feet. The ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes, with people cheering and whistling and calling for more. Dmitri and Sophie stood together, taking their bows, and in that moment they represented something larger than themselves. They represented the idea that talent could emerge from unexpected places, that assumptions could be challenged and overcome, and that true artistry transcended any physical limitation. After the concert, at the reception, people crowded around Sophie and Dmitri, eager to congratulate them and hear their story firsthand. A young girl, no more than 10 years old and clearly visually impaired, approached Sophie shyly. Her mother explained that her daughter had been studying piano for 2 years, but was getting discouraged because some of her teachers didn't think she could pursue it seriously. The girl asked Sophie if it was really possible for someone like them to become a real pianist. Sophie knelt down to the girl's level and spoke to her directly. She said that yes, it was possible, but it would be hard. People would doubt her, would make assumptions about what she could and couldn't do. She would have to work twice as hard as other students just to be taken seriously. But if she loved music, if she felt that connection to the piano the way Sophie did, then nothing else mattered. The piano didn't care if you could see, the music didn't judge. And somewhere out there would be people who would give her a chance, who would listen with open minds and hearts. The girl's face lit up with hope and she hugged Sophie tightly. Her mother thanked Sophie through tears, saying that her daughter had been talking about quitting piano lessons just last week. Watching Sophie perform tonight had changed her mind, had shown her what was possible. Sophie told them to stay in touch, gave them her contact information, and promised to help in any way she could. Dmitri watched this exchange and felt his eyes grow wet. This was what music was supposed to do: connect people, inspire them, give them courage. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Dmitri and Sophie found a quiet moment together. He told her that performing with her tonight, seeing the impact she had on that young girl and countless others, made him understand why he had devoted his life to music in the first place. It wasn't about the accolades or the fame or even the perfection of performance. It was about this, about touching people's lives, about showing them beauty and possibility. He had lost sight of that somewhere along the way, but she had helped him find it again. Sophie smiled and said he was giving her too much credit. She was just doing what she loved, following the path that felt right to her. But Dmitri shook his head. What she had done and continued to do went far beyond personal achievement. She was changing the entire classical music world, forcing it to confront its assumptions and expand its understanding of what musicians could be. She was opening doors for people who had been told those doors were closed to them. That was a legacy that would outlast any individual performance. In the years that followed, Sophie's career continued to flourish. She performed on every continent, recorded multiple albums, and won numerous prestigious awards. She became one of the most respected pianists of her generation, known not just for her technical abilities, but for the profound emotional connection she brought to everything she played. Critics struggled to describe what made her playing special, often concluding that it was something beyond analysis, something that had to be experienced to be understood. But perhaps more importantly, Sophie became a symbol of possibility for countless disabled musicians around the world. Music conservatories began actively recruiting blind and visually impaired students, developing better support systems and teaching methods. Concert halls improved their accessibility. Other disabled musicians felt empowered to pursue their dreams, knowing that someone had broken through the barriers before them. The landscape of classical music began to change, slowly but surely, becoming more inclusive and diverse. Dmitri remained one of Sophie's strongest advocates and closest friends. He often spoke about that night in Vienna, about the lesson she had taught him, and the ways it had transformed his understanding of music and humanity. He encouraged other established musicians to examine their own biases, to seek out and support talented artists who might not fit traditional molds. His advocacy carried weight in the classical music world, and it helped accelerate the changes that Sophie had begun. On the 5th anniversary of Sophie's victory at the Vienna competition, she and Dmitri performed together once more at the Musikverein, returning to the place where their story had begun. The concert was billed as a celebration, and the hall was packed with people who wanted to commemorate that extraordinary night and the journey it had sparked. The program included some of the same pieces Sophie had played in the competition, allowing the audience to hear how her artistry had deepened and matured. But the emotional high point came when Dmitri took the microphone before their final duet. He spoke to the audience about meeting Sophie, about his initial prejudice and dismissiveness, about being proven so thoroughly wrong. He talked about the shame he had felt and the growth that had come from that shame. He said that Sophie had given him a precious gift that night 5 years ago, not just her forgiveness but the opportunity to become a better person and a better musician. He dedicated their final performance to everyone who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated because of who they were rather than what they could do. As they played their final piece together, a transcription of Mahler's Adagietto from his Fifth Symphony, there was hardly a dry eye in the hall. The music was achingly beautiful, filled with longing and hope and profound human connection. Sophie and Dmitri played as one, their musical partnership now so deep that they seemed to breathe together, think together, feel together. The boundaries between them dissolved, leaving only the music pure and transcendent. When the final note faded into silence, the audience sat motionless for a long moment, unwilling to break the spell. Then the applause began, building into a roar of appreciation and love. Sophie and Dmitri stood together, hands clasped, taking their bows. Anna watched from the front row, remembering the scared 17-year-old girl who had walked onto this stage 5 years ago, determined to prove herself. That girl had grown into a remarkable woman, an artist of the highest caliber, and more than that, a force for positive change in the world. In the green room after the concert, surrounded by flowers and congratulations, Sophie sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought about that first note she had played in the competition, the note that had changed everything. She thought about Dmitri's transformation from critic to champion. She thought about all the young musicians who had reached out to her over the years, telling her that her example had given them courage to pursue their dreams. And she thought about the music itself, the eternal conversation between composer and performer and listener, the thing that had drawn her to the piano in the first place. The journey from that overlooked blind girl to this celebrated artist had been long and difficult, filled with obstacles and doubts and moments of despair. But it had also been beautiful, rewarding, and ultimately triumphant. Sophie had proven that talent could not be judged by sight, that music belonged to anyone who could feel it deeply enough, and that the human capacity for growth and change was limitless. She had turned silence into sound, doubt into certainty, and prejudice into understanding. And she had done it all one note at a time, with patience and passion and an unshakable belief in the power of music to transform lives. Her story was far from over, but already it had become a testament to the extraordinary things that could happen when the world finally decided to truly listen. Like, share, and subscribe, don't miss it.